I think it's going to be fine. I think it's going to be listenable. D3 Datacast.
So we always go for
I
it's
think
watchable,
I
it's
I
listenable.
think it's listenable. I mean, who knows? It's our tagline.
Welcome to another D3 Datacast. I'm Zach Snyder. He's Matt Snyder. And with our powers combined, we have a perfectly full head of hair and no signs of gray. How you doing, Matt?
I got that. So I got that.
I see you're wearing the hat
I
today. So
yeah.
you didn't know I was going to go with that intro, but
I have the gray.
they can see my head, so I think we know what you're covering
Yeah.
up.
Yeah. Yep. I have the gray.
All right, before we get into today's topic, want to just put another plug in for our previous episode that we released. We opened the first three card packs of our 2022-23 D3 Hoops trading cards. It was a lot of fun. Matt, I just checked in with the factory today. Progress on the next set of packs is going fabulously, so everyone should be on the lookout for that soon. But we've got another actual Division III basketball topic to come with today. And this isn't quite kind of redoing one of the earliest episodes we did, but our most dedicated longtime listeners will remember one of the very early episodes we did kicking off this show was to rank the top 10 conferences in Division Three. Now that was, using some efficiency margin metrics, some tournament success, and a little bit of good old-fashioned internet. Yeah, but I think so. This is a little bit of a different take. This time we're going to take all the conferences and use the efficiency margin metrics that you were tracking over the last year, apply those as on a conference scale, and take every conference, not just rank the top 10, but take all the conferences and put them into tiers.
Yeah, doing a conference tier list. Last time we did something similar to this, as you mentioned, we kind of left out 75% of the country. We only talked about those top conferences. This time we're going to talk about every conference, how they fared this past season, and we're going to kind of chunk them into these tier lists. Someone's got to be at the top, someone's got to be at the bottom. There's no value judgment against these institutions or programs. It's just, how they fall. So, Zach, you ready to get started?
Let's do it.
Should we start with the top tier teams or the bottom tier teams?
Let's work our way up.
Let's work our way up. Yeah, we got to
Hold everyone in suspense.
build some suspense. You're right. So, first things first. As you mentioned, this is mostly data based. So, based on the kind of average conference efficiency margins from just this past season, we're not looking historical data here. We're not looking back the last 3 years, just 2023 and how things fall. So, we're going to start off with the E tier teams, the bottom tier teams, bottom tier conferences. Sorry. This is kind of 6 groups of conferences here, but it's kind of an interesting list. If you can see, all the way at the bottom right is the independents, so that's like not even actually a conference. But let's just run down here. Who are the tier E teams? We've got the Cognac, we've got the CSAC, we've got the North Atlantic, the New England College Conference, we've got the SLIAC, and we've got those independents. The independents, there's really only like 3 that I was tracking last year. It's Maranatha Baptist and it's Bob Jones and Asbury. Those last 2 teams are in the provisional process of transitioning to Division Three, so they don't even really play full Division Three schedules. And my efficiency ratings only counts Division Three versus Division Three games. So it's kind of not really obviously not a real conference, but it's not even really a very full bucket. The other particularly interesting conference to me is the NECC, because that conference is only had 4 teams last year, and it's completely dissolving going forward. All the teams are headed elsewhere. So that was another really small bucket. But I think when it comes to the NAC, the SLIAC, the CSAC, and the Cognac, these are really conferences that are not competitive on the national stage. Maybe they have 1 or 2 teams that can play a competitive game here and there, but really top to bottom, these are mostly conferences with teams in the bottom half, maybe bottom quarter of Division Three. And really, when I looked at this tier, we're going to show this all the way at the end. But if you look at these kind of conferences graphically, there's a pretty big gap between these groups of teams and even the next tier up. So I think these are kind of the well-deserving teams to be in the bottom tier. I'm sorry, I'm going to say teams a lot. I mean conferences to be in the bottom tier. And that's just kind of how things go.
And you talked about the national stage, and what jumps out to me when you're looking at this list is when you get to that national tournament, it's typically the conference champions from the auto bids. A lot of times they're getting matched up with either top seeds or real kind of like what you consider to be some of the power teams heading into the tournament, which is tough because at yeah, anything can happen, upsets happen, but it's a tougher task the better team you go up against. And I think last year we saw two teams from these conferences go up against what the how the bracket was built, what you'd consider to be top seeds, and I think in every case it was a real kind of like power name. So tough sledding, but these are your one bid only, and even beyond that, but probably getting matched with really difficult first round opponents.
Yeah, I think doing bracketology exercises, at the end of the day, the thing I was most confident about it was that Wilson, the CSAC champion, was going to play Randolph Macon in the first round to kind of get like a bottom versus top. And as I check my bracket, I'm pretty sure that was the actual matchup there. Yes,
That
it was. Yeah.
Yep.
So moving up a tier, we're going to go to the D tier, and you're going to be able to see that the tiers sizes are not all the same number of teams. It kind of more groupings of teams than just an even number of teams. So we're going to go ahead to D tier. We're going to add a few more teams, kind of numbers 33 to 40 in this range. We've got the AMCC, we've got the Collegiate Conference of the South, we've got the MASCAC, we've got the President's Conference, we've got the SAA, we've got the Skyline, we've got the United East, and we've got the UMAC, the Upper Midwest Conference. Only really interesting team here from a positional standpoint is the Skyline. I mentioned there's a pretty big gap between Tier D and Tier E. Skyline was kind of right in the middle of that gap. There was like a 4 points of efficiency margin between the non-Skyline teams in this tier and then Tier E. So that was the big gap I was talking about. The Skyline was really in no man's land. And I bumped them up here for one big reason, and that was that they had like a 9.9 or negative 9.9 efficiency margin. So because they weren't on the wrong side of 10 and they were kind of right in the middle here, I kind of bumped them up to Tier D. But Skyline was right on the edge. We'd seen Yeshiva be quite strong the last couple of years. They weren't that this year. Farmingdale had some impressive games. They had an impressive NCAA tournament game where they took Christopher Newport right to the wire. The eventual national champions could have been knocked out early. But other than that, the Skyline doesn't have a lot going for it as far as, again, players on the national stage. And this year, Farmingdale and Yeshiva were only more like kind of like borderline top 100 candidates in my mind. So they weren't even really pushing into the top 100 very far. So no Pool C teams in Tier E. There were no Pool C teams here in Tier D either.
Yeah, and as you mentioned with what we saw from Farmingdale in the first round against Christopher Newport, you start to see, these one bid leagues maybe play a little bit more competitive games. But again, this isn't just about what is at the top. This is about the whole depth of the conference. And with, these not really being players in the Pool C picture, that kind of speaks to the overall depth. There's not that, second, third team. And so that's what's really going to separate these as like a D tier, as opposed to going forward what we see from the next tier.
Yeah, and again, as you said, Zach, very important to highlight that we're kind of talking about the conference as a whole. Right away, even in Tier D, you can see some good programs existing. Maryville in the CCS, right? We talked about what Yeshiva maybe had been in the past couple of years in the Skyline. Barry out of the SAA has had a good team this past year and was maybe in that conversation about could they get a Pool C or not. So definitely just because your conference is kind of in this range doesn't mean that you can't be either in that mix or on the fringes of the mix kind of nationally, even starting here at D tier conferences. Moving ahead to our biggest group, Tier C. This is right in the middle. This is kind of plus or minus 4 points of efficiency margin on either side of 0. Is our Tier C teams. And that makes sense. If you think of like a bell curve, it's going to be kind of biggest at the middle. And that's what we see here kind of reflected as I was breaking these up. We see Tier C. And here we get some conferences that had Pool C bids. I think we had 5 Pool C bids represented among Tier C conferences. So you can definitely be in the at-large tournament mix here. We've had some, very good conferences. Like I'm going to highlight the Southern California League, the SCIAC. They had 2, 3 teams at some points in the season in that Pool C conversation with Pomona Pitzer, with Claremont Mudscripts, with Redlands. I think ultimately they just got one Pool C team in, and they had that conference tournament upset situation going on, and carnage nationally. But that was a very good league this year, and to kind of only see them in a Tier C range might be kind of startling. But that speaks to the quality at the top, and also to the when you talk about either individual teams or conferences, once you get out of the top tier or two, teams really start to bunch up, and there's not a whole ton of separation maybe between teams. But I'm going to highlight also the GNAC here. A couple years ago, this would have been a Tier D, Tier E league maybe, but the strides that St. Joseph had made at the top of the conference, their one loss in the kind of pre-tournament run-up was the conference final against Albertus Magnus. So they ended up getting 2 teams into the tournament for that league. But having like a really elite team like that, I think pulled the GNAC up a whole tier. And there's some competitive play at the other. I mean, maybe not outside of Albertus in addition to them, but maybe 2 teams now that can kind of compete with maybe the higher end of the country. And that was enough, given the absurd quality of St. Joseph, to kind of pull them all the way up into Tier C. So some other teams here year to year, you might float some of these teams into the B tier. We had kind of what I might call a historically bad season out of the Michigan Intercollegiate Athletic Association. Not again that the top wasn't bad. Calvin, Trine, and Hope, who got into the tournament, I think they were all quite good, but the bottom fell out just drastically, and there was no depth there. And so the MIAA, who's probably not been an A tier conference, but maybe a B tier conference with some regularity, they'll kind of float between those 2 tiers, depending on kind of the depth of the league. So with some of these conferences, it's really about not just quality at the top, but what's your overall depth. And at Tier C, above Tier C, you really would like to see kind of top to bottom depth level. And a lot, I think what's maybe lacking for some of these conferences here, that we have teams existing in that national conversation, is that depth after maybe the 3 or 4 position.
For the benefit of our audio only listeners, Matt, I'd like to just read this whole list, because as you mentioned, this is our biggest group. It's kind of the middle. This is, if you're looking at a ranking, this would be number 13 to 32. So we have the Atlantic East, the AEC, the Coast to Coast, the Commonwealth Coast, the GNAC, the HCAC, the Empire 8, the Landmark, Liberty League, Little East, the Michigan Intercollegiate, the Midwest Conference, the MIAC, the MAC Freedom, the Northern Athletics, the Northwest Conference, the NUMAC, the SCAC, the SCIAC, the SUNYAC, and the USA South. So that's a 20 conference group here in the middle that we're calling, the C tier. And as we were putting this together, Matt, you asked me, is this too big? And then if you look at the efficiency margin, who would fall off that list if we pared it down, if I'm remembering correctly, the in terms of at least the overall conference efficiency margin, the lowest, or maybe it was the second lowest, was the SCIAC. And it just did not feel right to me to have the SCIAC included with the previous group of conferences to this group. So that I think, we have, as you mentioned, in terms of a bell curve, it makes sense to have a bigger group in the middle. And I think the SCIAC definitely belongs with this group. And then also, I think there's a lot of conferences here that, depending on the year, you mentioned the MIAA, at least at the bottom, was down a little bit. Depending on the year, you could see a number of these challenge to be a top 10 league in any given year. So I think it made sense that it ended up being quite big here. Like I said, if you start looking at the actual conferences to move around to pare this down a little bit, I don't think it would have been fair to those conferences.
Yeah, so I think it was the Midwest Conference and the Heartland Conference that were the last 2. I think SCIAC was more like middle of this tier list. But yeah, I think the point stands. There are these teams that, maybe you could see them as the bottom of Tier C, but it really doesn't make sense to make that whole conference a D tier conference. So yeah, I think, and once I'll show this graphically at the end, but when you see kind of all the teams bunched up in the middle, I think it makes sense. If anything, you could almost argue that D tier is really sort of an appendage to the back of the C tier, but I think separating further out that D tier did make a whole lot of sense.
Yeah, you're correct. SCIAC was in the middle. So the bottom of this in terms of the efficiency margin would be the Midwest Conference and the AC, but just above them is the Coast to Coast,
Yeah,
featuring our national champion.
Christopher Newport. But again,
Yep.
a really weird league. Like they have Christopher Newport,
Yep.
who's far
And
and
then
away above
Finlandia.
Mary Washington, and then they had like Finlandia. Obviously, that was dragging the whole thing down. Which RIP to Finlandia, closing, won't be around anymore, unfortunately. All right, let's move on to B tier. So we're going to see a lot of power names here starting off. I'll start by reading it. Again, shouts to the Spotify listeners out there, audio only. B tier is going to be the number 5 through number 12 conference. So we have the American Rivers, the American Southwest, the Centennial, the MAC Commonwealth, the NJAC, the North Coast, the OAC, and the Old Dominion Athletic Conference. So here is a B tier range. We're starting to see some separation. We're starting to see some great quality. The previous tier, remember, it was like 20 teams that had 5 Pool C teams in there. With this group, 8 conferences, we had 6 Pool C teams represented on these conferences here. So we're starting to get, again, those major players on the national stage when it comes time for February regional rankings, Pool C predictions, selections. These are the conferences, B tier and A tier, that are really the major names here. Shouts to the NJAC. They had 2 Pool C bids. They had 3 tournament teams. The only non-tier A conference to have more than 2 tournament teams.
Now, one of those that didn't have multiple tournament teams, national tournament teams, was the American Rivers. But that's an really interesting case because you look at a top 6 really that are like all top 100 teams. So they didn't have that. Well, really, even one team at the really top end of whether you want to talk top 25 voting or Massey ratings, but that next 50, from like 50 to 100, they were just packed. That goes a lot deeper than a lot of other conferences can claim. So you see a depth coming through in different ways. In the case of the American Rivers, it's just a bunch of teams that are maybe ranked in that like 50 to 100 area. And in the case of the NJAC, you're seeing it come through with multiple NCAA tournament bids.
Yeah, and great to highlight the depth, because I think that's one of the big things that separates a tier B team from a tier B conference from a tier C conference, is just that overall depth. We don't lose a whole lot of quality all the time. I'm generalizing here, after that second, third, fourth team in the conference. The American Rivers was a special case all year. The entire conference is in the top 100 or 150 teams in Division 3. So you're talking about the whole top third of Division 3. So that even if the American Rivers didn't have a surefire top 25 team this whole season, it was just a deep conference. Only one bid, but still, it's a conference that could have gone up to anyone else in the region, anyone else in the country, and 1 through 8. If you do like a ARC versus NJAC challenge, I might take the American Rivers in that, just because the overall depth was so strong.
And it was coming out of that as the automatic qualifier. And if I'm remembering correctly, they were like the 6th seed in the conference tournament, and that sounds like an upset in a lot of conferences, but there just was not that much separating like the top 6 in that conference, that it really, if the 6th seed winning the conference tournament is not an upset in any league, it's American Rivers.
Yeah, for sure. All right, we're going to jump up to our tier A teams, top 4 conferences. And again, when we show this graphically, it's going to make sense. But these are the names. It's really not going to be a surprise to anyone that these are the tier A conferences. These are the conferences that we talk about almost all season long, starting with the season previews of which teams to watch out for. We have the CCIW, we have the NESCAC, we have the WIAC, and we have the UAA. And for me this year, and I think the numbers will bear this out, the UAA was kind of by far and away. Maybe that's a little too strong, but the best conference in Division Three. But again, they were like ARC plus in that
Yeah.
they had several teams that were vying for the top 25, but they didn't really have that team that was in the top 10 and the number one for the whole season. They just had a bunch of teams that you're like, they might be between 15 and 25, and that's three quarters of the conference right there. Almost everyone except for Chicago and probably Brandeis. Even Carnegie Mellon was getting consideration for some of those spots by some voters for a lot of the season, and they were like the fifth or sixth team in that conference for much of the year. So the UAA just had a ton of depth, and I know I like to kind of poke fun about them not getting out of the first weekend, but that kind of thing just kind of happens. Those teams all deserved to be in that consideration there, even Rochester, who we talked about for hours and hours on end about on Pool C selection night. But they were all really strong teams. It's a really good league. And even though they didn't have maybe that top 5-10 type of a team, it was still really solid. And the CCIW, the WIAC are always right along there with them. And I think NESCAC kind of deserves to be mentioned in the same range as well. These are all conferences that you are probably more surprised than not surprised if they have only one team in the top 25 year in, year out. They're in consideration for. They're going to receive multiple Pool C at-large bids. I think there were 9 at-large bids represented by these 4 conferences in the NCAA tournament. And that's amazing. There's only 20 at-large bids to go around, or at least there were last year. And here's 4 leagues taking 9 of those spots.
Yeah, I was going to make the same point about the UAA kind of being the ARC plus, right? So whereas I looked it up on Massey, so Dubuque was 46th, the only team in the ARC inside the Massey top 50, but the UAA placed 5 inside the top 50, with everyone in the conference, including Chicago, finishing inside the Massey top 100. So you've got a top 100 game every night, even playing the last place team. That hardly happens. So it's just everyone is really good, and there's even that quality a little bit more towards the top. Now, there's a few names on this list that I think people like to complain about because maybe they do things a little bit differently or not how some other conferences do things, namely here the NESCAC and the UAA. But really, those kind of complaints shouldn't really denigrate the quality of the teams or the quality of the leagues. These are great leagues filled with great depth of really good teams.
Yeah, and the biggest beef with the NESCAC has always been that single round robin, one time through the conference, and that's it. And really, that's a NCAA strength of schedule argument because they don't play that double round robin. They only play 9 conference games maybe. Whenever you have a conference game, you have a team in your league that gets a win and a loss, and that kind of pulls your strength of schedule for your league or all the teams in your league towards 500. So the NESCAC has this sort of advantage in playing the single round robin where they can go out and schedule other teams around them and get wins for each other's strength of schedule. And of course, they get wins because they're good teams and they're better than the schools, the leagues around them, of course. But that's that. I think that complaint against the NESCAC doesn't really have to do with like an efficiency ratings kind of a discussion as much as like the way the NCAA calculates it. So I think you're right. They definitely deserve credit for their overall quality. I think those teams are good. I think we would like to continue to see them at events like the Great Lakes Invitational, at the UAA NESCAC Challenge that's kind of been going on the last couple of years, or maybe last year was the first year and it's going to go on again this year and maybe expand. Great teams playing great teams is what we want to see. I think the reputation of the NESCAC is a lot of those teams have avoided some of those games, and we'd like to see them play them.
Yep, definitely. So I think this was a pretty clear when we did the episode last summer. I think this was a pretty clear top 4 for us back then, and then just looking at this season, away there. So those B tier conferences have a lot of work to do to catch up or to try to push into tier A here.
Yeah, I think if you're likely to see a team or a conference make a push up, maybe the OAC is kind of been on that verge. Maybe the ODAC has been kind of on that verge of being on the rise. So we can see how next year ends up. I think that'll be interesting for sure. Yeah, I think fifth was the ODAC, so maybe they were on the edge. But there was a gap between 4 and 5, and I think that's why we made the tier break there. So I'm going to advance one slide here, and we're going to look at kind of just graphically how these map out. Sorry, Spotify listeners, but you'll have to check out the YouTube to see this visual. And this is just a plotting of offensive efficiency on the horizontal axis and defensive efficiency on the vertical axis. So as you go up, that's teams that allow more points. As you go to the right, those are offenses that score more points. So you want to be in the bottom right of this chart. That means you score a lot of points and you don't give up very many points. And you can kind of see the breakdown there of those top 4 conferences, the UAA, the NESCAC, the CCIW, and the WIAC. They do it in slightly different ways, offense versus defense, but they get that overall quality. And there's that separation there, kind of in that diagonal, kind of the diagonal from top left to bottom right is overall team quality there. And you can see those top 4 separating themselves. And then on the other end, you can really see those E-tier teams on the backside, kind of that gap there. Got the skyline hanging out in the corner intersection between the orange and the red boxes. But other than that, there's a fair gap between like MASCAC and AMCC, and then where the CSAC lands. And then there's that big jumble in the middle of that yellow box, just a bunch of conferences that are right around that 100 line of overall average teams making up overall average conferences. And then the blue box is those kind of teams sandwiched right between C and A. Got the ODAC, the ARC, the ASC, teams that are kind of conferences that are kind of maybe right on the outside. Definitely have teams good enough to compete with the likes of the CCIW, the WIAC, and the UAA. But overall, as a conference, just kind of being just a half step back behind them.
Yeah, we talked about the skyline being kind of a fringe case between what we have for tiers E and D. And you see there, if you look on the x-axis, they're kind of similarly placed in terms of the offensive efficiency, but defensively, they definitely come out ahead of what we put it there in the bottom tier. So that ultimately is what kind of gets them into that second tier.
Yep, and when you're making this kind of a list or a chart, I could have bumped them just on either side of the line. They were kind of a right on the line edge case for me. And then the other interesting thing is that orange box, that D tier, how it more closely butts up to the C tier, and it has more of a gap to the E tier. So that's what I mentioned earlier. It's almost like an appendage onto the C tier. But I kind of just felt like that would just made the middle tier just way too big, and I wanted to find a line there, and I kind of did on that kind of plus or minus 4 efficiency margin line is kind of the separation there.
Yeah, and there's another line there that butts up between C and B. So where we talked about, there's a number of those in that C tier where we, in the right year, you could see them being considered like a top 10 league, and you can see them all lined up right kind of on the edge between C and B there. But again, it's like, where do you draw the distinctions?
Yep. Yeah, and there's always a lot of gray when you're talking about the dividing line between a tier. If it's not going to be like really discrete chunks, then at some point there's like just over the line or you're just under the line, for sure.
And interesting to see how the ARC jumps out in that B tier. We talked about them not having the national power name at the top of that conference, but with the overall depth, especially in that top half and even going throughout the conference, you can see just how solidly even in that B tier they are.
Yeah. Yeah, and the B tier team that surprised me the most the other way was I thought the OAC would be kind of right up there with the ARC and with the ODAC, pushing towards the A tier teams conferences, but they weren't. They were kind of middle of the road, maybe even back half of that tier, kind of closer to the NCAC than I thought. Now the NCAC had, I think, a really good year and kind of closed that distance, but I was expecting the OAC. Maybe I just had like Mount Union Final Four run fresh in my mind, and I was thinking of them really, really highly. But that was a good league. John Carroll was good. Again, we talked a lot of the year about how the efficiency ratings, for whatever reason, didn't value John Carroll quite as high as maybe some of the human voters, so that maybe is pulling them backwards just a little bit. maybe there's some quality issues at the bottom of the conference, but overall, it's a really deep conference. So that's not an overall issue necessarily.
Yeah, I wanted to bring up John Carroll because we talked about that a number of times throughout the season, that for whatever reason, the computer just didn't really like John Carroll as much as, even their record indicated, much less, top 25 voting or something like that. So do you think that that is, showing up here as well? And it's hard to say how much, one team is pulling the entire conference there, but do you think that's the case here? And were there any other team cases that you noticed maybe throughout the season that you feel like might be showing up even here as we're looking at a conference level?
Yeah, on John Carroll, I don't remember exactly off the top of my head, but I think that my computer liked them like 25 rather than 15 or something like that. So that's definite. That would be pulling them back a little bit compared to where maybe a human voter might have the overall conference. But again, we're still talking about a team that the computer overall liked quite a bit. So that's not really. It's probably having a small effect. I would have to maybe like figure out exactly how much, but if it's like 4 points of efficiency margin and you're dividing that by whatever the OAC is, 9 or 10 teams, it's really not moving the needle tremendously just to have John Carroll there. So it's probably just an overall depth, and I'd have to see again, where it had each of those teams. Maybe Mount Union was slightly low, maybe John Carroll was slightly low, maybe those things can kind of cascade if every team is just, for whatever reason, just a couple points lower than maybe a subjective voter might have them, then it can pull them down. As far as other team cases, we mentioned the GNAC. I think St. Joseph pulls them up probably a full tier just by themselves. I think that's definitely one. Yeah, other than that, I don't think I can recall a team case necessarily.
Yeah, if you look at Massey ratings, St. Joseph finished fourth. Albertus Magnus was 102, so
Yeah.
actually not even inside the top 100. But um, when you're talking about just trying to get into the C tier, you're talking about just, you know, still the bottom side of 50% line for overall D3.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's a big league, and the bottom drops out after you go, 2 or 3 deep.
Yeah. Yep. So anyway, that's our conference tier list for 2023. Looking back at the past year we just played, obviously things are going to change next year, but this is kind of where the league's shaped up this past season.
That'll wrap up this episode. Like I said, we won't be too far off with our next pack opening video. We plan to open 4 more packs, so that will be another 40 team base cards and another 8 special insert cards. Be on the lookout for that. If you're not a subscriber on YouTube, highly recommend you do that. And then you can head right to your subscriptions page and see it as soon as it drops. Also, you can follow us on Twitter at D3 Datacast, Facebook.com/D3 Datacast. We'd love for you to connect with us on any and all of those social media platforms that you may participate in. And until next time, good job, team.